I'm a hapless character, and almost everything I attempt goes wrong. How did I get all those jobs? The answer is clear. The interview panels, the councils have interviewed me and they've interviewed Kate and they've said, look, his wife is magnificent. She has fabulous people skills. She's warm, she's lovely, she has incredible gifts of hospitality. Do you know she's formally trained in food technology and hospitality? She has considerable gifts of pastoring. We've got to get her, so I suppose we'll have to take him. I've never said myself as important, and I say to staff, I'm not important. And that's not a line, it's a belief. Because it's not actually about me. And so I refer sometimes with staff to Paul's body image in Romans and 1 Corinthians. And all of us are vital because I'm interdependent with the gardener and the people who do the photocopying and everybody else. And their role under God is also significant and necessary. Now, it helped me be convinced that I wasn't important because my father for the first 20 years told me most days that I was worthless. So I haven't really had a great problem with ego to suppress. He was an acid salesman, which might explain his acerbic tongue. My mother was a typist, and I grew up in a war service home, and there were no other children. And so the only sentient being in the house that liked anybody else or was liked by anybody else was the dog. And I went to an agricultural high school, it was the top selective school in Sydney. And the legacy of that is as follows. Whenever I see a young person with a nose ring, I have an almost irresistible desire to tap her into the fence. So everything I do, and it did work well in Essex when Kate and I had a problem in a paddock where we were confronted by a bull that was raising its head up and down and stamping its foot. Kate was hiding behind me and just peeping around with the camera. And I said to the bull, I'll have you know I went to an agricultural high school. And the bull turned around and fled. But at the 20th reunion, the first time I'd seen my classmates, the boys in the A class arrived and they were mostly academics, tutors living in penury, driving beaten-up Cortinas. You remember the Ford Cortina? And the boys in the B class arrived. One of them was a professor, another was a senior lecturer, and some of them arrived towing boats, and I don't mean rowboats. Some of the boys from the C class, which is the bottom class, landed their own private jets at the aerodrome next door to the resort. And the boy who failed altogether and had to repeat, just one boy, was the director of the Sydney Aquarium. Now, that turned on its head many of my thoughts about education, and I'm still thinking about it. So I went to university, where I was completely invisible, apparently, because hardly anybody that I was in a group with remembers me. The people who were my Bible study leaders don't remember that I was there. So I made a big impression, a bit like Spark and Milligan, you know. Hitler, my part in his downfall? No part, really. But at university, I did manage to do government 1, 2 and 3. And in government 3, it was during the Vietnam War, and it was an entirely objective course. The lecturer didn't refer to the Americans and the South Vietnamese, he referred to the imperialists and their lackeys, the running dogs. Top course at Sydney University was run by the former Secretary of the Australian Communist Party, now descended into cynicism. And most of the people there were wanting to know how to start a revolution, because that's what the course is about, revolutions. And there were some nuns wanting to understand liberation theology, but the kind of revolution I wanted was quite a different one. It was a Christian revolution. And so I was sent off to Sydney Grammar School as a student teacher. Sydney Grammar School is like Churchie. It's the top academic independent school in New South Wales. And in that school, the student teachers, the prac teachers, were used and abused. We got the extra classes when someone's away. And I well remember, this is etched into my very being, going to a year 10 or 4th one as it was then, English class with Judith Wright's great poem, Bullocky. And I said to the boys, what kind of poem is this? And the boy, immaculate in his suit, best I had was a sports jacket, stood up because that's what they did, and he said, Sir, the sarcasm drooping from his address, Sir, this is the kind of poem that student teachers bring in to show we boys how poetry is written. I said, thank you very much, you're quite correct, sit down. And then I had my own Year 9 English class where there was a bright young boy who was working with a professional writer. His name was Michael Carr Gregg. Went on to be Australia's best adolescent psychologist, Professor Carr Gregg. And in Year 11, modern history, there was a very quiet boy then called Malcolm Turnbull. And people had said to me, I suppose the letter from Malcolm saying he couldn't really have made it in his career without you teaching the unification of Italy is in the mail. And I said, yes, I expect his correspondence is in the mail. And after I told the boys what we were doing the next lesson, came in the next day, one bloke put up his hand and he said, Sir, I was reading Dennis Smith's book, The Making of Modern Italy, that you recommended, and on page 172, he says, and I don't agree with that. Another boy put up his hand and he said, Sir, I'm with Proud Man. I believe all property is theft. I'm an anarchist. And I thought, this is how you rev up a student teacher. But after that, I actually met the anarchists because I was sent to Lanier High School, which is in Sydney's west. It was such a difficult school that those who went there were counted as having done their obligatory country service. There were 1,400 students in the school. The administration had some hope of controlling A block, but they lost the rest. And so when the bell rang for class, between periods, the deputy would walk around the balconies pushing kids into classrooms, any kid, any classroom, to get them in. And then he would go to the staff rooms to plead with the staff to actually And I got my comeuppance with 9M, the 13th graded English class, because they were illiterate, and I found it hard to go from Sydney Grammar School top English class to them. It was a little difficult. And I got my come up from my first form Year 7 English class, when in the first lesson I took in that wonderful book by Kenneth Grahame, Wind in the Willows. And one 12-year-old girl put up a hand and said, get rid of this and give us sex. It was a difficult school, 44 in each class. These days when I go to class, and I sit in a piece out there, and then I look under the furniture to try to find the rest. So there's too many kids in this class now. Must be getting older. So I had roll call, and roll call was every afternoon because the kids weren't especially able, and so as roll call was on, they stayed, which is the only way that we could keep them inside the school. And I could actually manage to mark the roll if I stood with my back against the door. But the trouble with that is that when I opened the door to let them go, they would punch me as they left. So it was, I suppose, baptism by fire, and I learned to teach, because initially I learned to survive. And then after 7 years I was transferred from Lanier to Lumia High School. A couple of stops down the line, terribly confusing. And during my final year at Lanier, I saw troublemaker after troublemaker from my Year 7 class leave the parents were moving the family somewhere else. And I rubbed my hands with glee. And then I walked in on the first day to Year 8 Lunaire High School, and there they were. I think perhaps I wasn't surprised by the difficulties because, firstly, I knew it wasn't about me. I was clay, it was about what the Lord might be forming. And I also didn't buy the view of humanity that I was offered in teacher training, which was essentially that we're moving to perfect the human spirit. And if we were just nice to the kids, they'd be nice to us. They had no Christian anthropology, and I wasn't surprised that people behaved badly because they had a concept of sin. One thing that did work in all this behaviourism, be it Skinner and so forth, was sometimes the glasser room. You remember the glasser green rooms, the withdrawal rooms? It worked wonderfully well in one school because when kids behaved so badly, they were sent to the withdrawal room. In this school was next to the music practice room, and music was taught very, very badly in that school. And after a day in there listening to the kids practice, they'd promise to do anything to get out. They'd beg, they'd plead, they'd sign any contract, they'd So I found that work was difficult, but these difficulties were actually parallel to my private life. You see, I've always been a duffer who got most things wrong. And so, yes, my children laugh at the fact that when I tried to photocopy something, the paper came out on fire. And the cover that got fixed was swinging on its hinge for the next 10 years. And they do marvel at the fact that I might ring one of them 14 times as I walk home. And that I have lots of photos of an old man, it happens to be me, that were accidental. But perhaps the main disaster was my last day of competitive cricket, when I'd risen to the heights of opening batsman for Lansdale P in the local competition. And as I pulled up, there was a ditch that was covered by grass and it ripped a mud flap off the car. Kate got out and immediately a nail went through her foot. I parked behind the grandstand, but the captain of the other team hit the ball over the grandstand and landed on the bonnet of my car. And I ran to take a spiralling catch, and to my amazement I held it, but I hadn't heard the call of no ball, and there was a run out on glass holding the ball aloft in triumph. So at the end of that match I was dropped and replaced by a player with a broken hand. So I waited by the phone and by the computer for the call up by the national selectors, but it hasn't come yet. I can be a stodgy opening batsman like Jeff Lockett, I can do that. Now perhaps the best thing that's happened to me is that I met my wonderful wife Kate, and her mother advised her firmly against me. There were a number of objections her mother had. Firstly, I didn't smile enough. Secondly, I'd grown up in the wrong part of Sydney. And thirdly, my parents were divorced, but most of all, I hadn't been to Moore Theological College. And Kate ignored the mother, and she's paid the price ever since. Her father had a more liberal view. He had a view of military rank because he'd been a member of the Royal Navy, and so he reserved judgment in case I became important. But we married, and my groom's speech went for so long we actually had an intermission in the middle. And the photos at the beginning showed broad sunlight streaming through the windows behind me, and the photos at the end are pitch black. That might be a kind of indication of how long ago tonight, but we shall see. The idea of stumbling around in the dark seems to be a good metaphor really for what I've done since. Now you see, Kate is good at almost everything. Almost everything. I'm good at almost nothing. And we've worked out what I'm actually good at, or reasonably good at, and it's this: killing insects. So retirement plan sees me possibly on the flip track, with my hoses and my chemicals, cockroaches, watch out, here I come. So my career, I'm going to quite put it like that, led me to be appointed as the youngest government school, high school principal in New South Wales, still in short pants. How did that happen? Don't know. God put me there, presuming there might be some kind of use. And there were some difficulties. I opened a brand new school. I was firmly disciplined by the Department of Education because I hadn't been answering their group faxes. And so I wrote back by snail mail and said, well, if you gave the school a fax machine, early on, I received a letter from the Director of Human Resources which said, "Dear, comma," most endearing way I've ever been addressed by the department. "Dear, we note you've been appointed as principal of John High School. A system of performance appraisal will obtain." I thought, they'll never find me. These were the days of the Greiner government in New South Wales, a very long time ago, 1988 to 1992, and the Greiner mantra was to let the managers manage, so I was allowed to choose my own staff in a government school, and that was just extraordinary. I've got fabulous, brilliant people, and then the government changed, and I was sent people who were nominated to go by the principals because they were the worst in the school. So a dichotomous school, some were fabulous and magnificent and others were actually clinically insane. And there was one memorable day where a teacher had commenced teaching at the age of 58, which was a terrible decision. And he burst into my office one Friday afternoon after school and shouted at me, "The reason that my boys and girls are uncontrollable is that you're incompetent as principal." So I said the only reasonable thing I could say at the time, which was, "Would you like a cup of tea?" Now, I had a sense the Lord was preparing this bit of broken pottery. I didn't get my first preference for either of my schools as head of department, but I was hugely blessed because in the first of those positions, I served a brilliant deputy. He was a Christian pastoral figure who was just magnificent. They were the caning days, and regularly boys would thank him for caning. Magnificent Christian pastoral figure. And then I went to serve a principal who was very Christian and very brave, and he would not be deterred from doing what was biblical and right, no matter what pressure was put on him by anybody. His school motto was loyalty, sincerity and generosity, and that described him. And eventually the Department of Education, having moved to try to reprimand him, then became fearful of him and eventually decided to harness him. And so, although the school was all grammatical, it was built on a creek bed and the box flooded when it rained, we had international delegations all the time coming to see this man and what a good school looks like. It was a magnificent Christian contribution, and through God's grace he became my chairman at my next school for quite a long time. One thing I learned, employ better jars than oneself. Employ better jars. Some principals are frightened of hiring outstanding people because they feel they'll be showing up. I want people who are better than I am because they actually live the capacity of the whole organisation. The Lord unsettled me, partly because I have taken on the role of the chairmanship of the principals in new schools and even come into Queensland to visit principals of new schools, and I put my hand up and said, new schools need more money. So the department's way of responding to that was to mount a full inquiry to try and find something wrong with the finances in my school. They didn't. But at the same time, I was been given a vision for Christian education, which came out of nowhere because because I read nothing and hadn't been in a Christian school. And I went off to St Paul's Grammar School at the foot of the Blue Mountains. And as soon as I arrived, nearly all of the executive left. One of whom was Christine Hill, who's here tonight, who had a very weak excuse that her husband had been transferred by bumming to Brisbane. Not a good reason, not a good reason really. So really I had to rely upon the Lord for this priestly ministry and vocation of being in schools. And through the Lord's grace, I'd been there 1 week. And I went off to a conference at Trinity Grammar School in Sydney to be addressed by Trevor and Margaret Cooper. And what I learned on that night has bounced around in my brain for over 25 years, and you'll hear more of that tomorrow. So I stumbled forward, and this is what we do, I think, when we lead schools. We don't always have a clear view of the road. We stumble forward, trusting in God. And what some of my friends contributing to the literature are saying is that there's such a thing as the COLLIER wager in Christian schools. What they mean by that is my view that if you offer an outstanding school, which delivers what people see as significant, they will acquiesce in allowing you, they'll acquiesce in you bringing the gospel to them. And that worked very well at St Paul's, and it's worked in other schools. So I ended up at St Andrew's Cathedral School. I hadn't applied. I was sort of fetched. And the school's in Anglican head office. It's 20 metres from the cathedral into the diocese. And the school serves the most secular humanist demography in Australia, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics and their census results. And so it was necessary to find a way to indicate the beauty of Christian faith and the credibility of Christian faith in a way that might resonate with ordinary people. But the first challenge was the staff, because the previous head left after a row with Sydney Diocese, and so parents and staff thought that I was a plant sent in by the Archbishop Jensen and his brother Philip to destroy the culture of the school and return it to a medieval fundamentalism. I said to the Archbishop, how did they find out so soon? Anyway, happily, we had the wonderful services there at various times of Trevor Cooling and David Smith. And it was difficult to get staff to understand this commodity called Christian education. And so some of them had the sense, well, I'm teaching my maths lesson, and then suddenly I stop and yell out to the kids, turn or burn, you're all going to hell. I don't get on with the lesson. And Trevor was able to relax them by saying, stop trying to inject things that are not seamless, rather maximise what's already there and use what comes naturally out of the curriculum that can be taught in terms of Christian view and using Christian pedagogy. And David has been very helpful to the staff there in explaining how classrooms in a Christian sense can be places of hospitality. And that's certainly given some drive in those schools. The Lord gave me an Indigenous school at the same time, and so we had the problem of working out how to explain Christian spirituality within an Indigenous frame. Difficult to do. There were some other strange things that happened there, one of which was we had an IT consultancy, which is free, and part of the deal was the headmaster had to speak for 30 minutes to the consultants about his vision for IT assisted education. My problems with computers begin at the PowerPoint. But apparently I spoke cogently for half an hour, using all the right words in full sentences. And the deputies were convinced that I was an expert. I had no idea what any of the words meant. I was like a parrot, just dealing with this stuff. Now, I really do need to tell you about my major faux pas, because these are kind of endemic to COLLIER. in my first school, my career nearly ended in the fourth year. We had a boy in year 10 called Nigel, who was the year fool. He was the fool of year 10. Everybody knew he was the fool. And on playground duty, some boys came to me and they said, "Sir, Nigel's annoying us," to which I responded, "Oh, take my phone over that fence." So I walked down to the end of my platinum beat, which was long, thin, rectangular, turned around, and about 100 metres away, one had Nigel by the arms and the other by the legs. And up he went over the fence. Then the ambulance came. And the next day, his mother came and said to the principal, "Why did you, Mr. Collier, tell these boys to throw my son over the fence?" The Steffi would give a good answer, really. But one does one's best. But that wasn't the end of it, because some 5 years later I had a major car accident. And as I lingered between life and death, I came to, and there was Nigel's brother, who was a nursing sister, standing over me with a very, very large needle. And there was another inmate who pressed his buzzer relentlessly, incessantly, day and night. And the next day he got up to go to work, and the nurse said to him, "Mr. X, what are you doing? You can't go to work." And someone from one of the other wards yelled out, "Let him go, let him go." But there's more. Perhaps not as bad, but there's more. When I was a deputy, I did see a boy in assembly who was misbehaving, and I told the boy in the yellow shirt to step out. That wasn't particularly because the uniform was yellow shirts. It's true, his uniform was brilliantly homo-washed yellow, but after that, my class the next lesson wanted to know if boys with yellow shirts could leave the building first. So I stagger on amidst foolishness and folly and do my very best. Now, after all this, I was called to Malden College, Baptist Theological College, to be Dean of Education. And so that was an opportunity, but what could I possibly do? The Lord provided an answer, because out of the distance came the very kind figure of my old friend, Dr. Craig Murison. And so Malden has a great partnership with CHC in initial teacher education, and offers its own master's degrees, and essentially Malden sends some master's students, I think, to CHC in terms of their interests, and CHC sends some to Malden. It's what we might call a divine wind, Craig, in this case the Holy Spirit. So, my role now is to be a gadfly. That is to say, my commission as a head of school is to annoy people. Some people say to me, "He must be very good at the school because you're very annoying." And my main role seems to be to annoy the Sydney Anglican Diocese. The poor Archbishop really can't get away. He was our minister before being Archbishop, as Dean of the Cathedral. He was my chairman for 5 years at my last school. He's our neighbour. He's a sitting duck. And what's my message to the Anglican heavyweights? It's simply this. The research shows that most people who come to faith do so by the age of 18. They're not in churches by and large. The Sydney Anglican Diocese, which is the most evangelical diocese in the world, in case you don't know that, stretches from nearly Newcastle to down halfway to the Victorian border and west to the Blue Mountains. 270 churches, 45,000 adults. In the 39 Anglican schools just within Sydney itself, there are 45,000 children. And beyond that, all of their parents, their grandparents, the mission reach is enormous. And so I've said to the diocese, the ministry of Christian schools matters. And the response in the main has been, no it doesn't, because God works with people through churches. So my role is to be a gadfly